Welcome to another PMDG MD11 training session from Angle of Attack. In this episode, we are going to be doing a hand-flown ILS approach. This will be one of the tougher approaches as in its later stages, it places a lot of emphasis on hand flying and very precise hand flying at that. So we will be flying the ILS runway 36 center approach into Amsterdam. We will jump in on the Ilde 1 Alpha arrival just over 10 miles from the Echo Lima VOR, which is about 30 miles off this chart to the northeast. The first altitude restriction is at the initial approach fix, RTIP. We will need to be in between flight level 100 and flight level 70 here. Since we are jumping into this approach relatively late, we will not need any more information from the arrival chart, so let's jump over to the approach chart. Our tip is located 32 nautical miles east-northeast of the airport. We will fly inbound to the Schiphol VOR from our tip and turn overhead the airport onto the 207 radial outbound. At 13.3 DME, waypoint Echo Hotel 657, we will start our left turn to intercept the final approach course of 004 and hand fly down the ILS to runway 36 center. Let's go through the facts as always. Frequencies. The two frequencies we need for the navigation radios are the Schiphol VOR 108.4 and the ILS DME for runway 36 center 108.75. Altitudes. We will aim to pass overhead the Schiphol VOR at flight level 70 and Echo Hotel 657 at minimum of 3,000 feet. We will need to be at 2,000 feet at the final approach fix. This chart is a good illustration of why it is so important to consider transition altitude. Note that the altitude for Sierra Papa Lima is flight level 70, whereas later on at Echo Hotel 657, it is labeled at 3,000 feet. Flight level 70 is 7,000 feet with our altimeter set to the standard pressure setting of 1013 hectopascals. Transition altitude is indicated as 3,000 feet. So before reaching 3,000, we will need to set our altimeter to the local QNH, which we will get from the ATIS. This is a precision approach, so our minimum altitude is referred to as the DH, decision height. Unlike on a precision approach, if we reach the decision height without runway or lights in sight, we must go around immediately, and we cannot just level off and keep looking for those approach lights. So decision height for this approach is 190 feet, pretty low. Course. Final approach course is 004, with missed approach on that same exact course actually. Terrain. About 20% of the Netherlands lies below sea level. In fact, Schiphol is fairly unique in that the field elevation is actually negative 11 feet. Nonetheless, we still need to be aware of our minimum safe altitude. The highest MSA is 2,300 feet to the southeast of the Schiphol VOR. Safety. This will be a very low visibility approach. I'll let the cat out of the bag now and tell you that we will be seeing the runway right at minimums. The ILS is very sensitive, so our hand flying will need to be spot on all the way down. Weather is reported as moderate snow, so be ready for less than ideal braking action. A firm touchdown is definitely recommended under these circumstances. Speaking of the weather, let's get the ATIS. Starting off the airbag checklist. This is Schiphol Arrival Information Delta, main landing runway 36 center, secondary landing runway 36 right, transition level 35, wind 010 degrees at 7 knots, visibility 1,000 meters, moderate snow, clouds ceiling 500, temperature -10, dew point -9, QNH 1008 hectopascals. Contact approach and arrival with call sign only and information delta. As always, we'll continue with the airbag checklist by installing the approach. The last waypoint in the flight plan before the airport is NOVEN. Press the line select key beside NOVEN to get to its lateral revision page, then select star to get to the star and approach selection page. Because there are so many approaches available, we will need to use the up-down slew keys on the McDo to scroll through the list. When you have scrolled to it, select the ILS 36 center approach, then push line select key 6 left to insert it. This takes us to the approach transition page. This shows us all the transitions available. So as we covered when looking at the chart, we'll be taking the RTIP transition. So select RTIP from the list, and once selected, we will be taken back to the flight plan page where the changes we just made are now visible. We need to clean up the route a little now and specify altitude restrictions for the appropriate waypoints. Firstly, close the discontinuity between NOVEN and RTIP. Second, the FMS has put in 2 custom waypoints between RTIP and Sierra Papa Lima. These waypoints are placed to create altitude and speed restrictions along this section of the approach. Looking back at the star chart though, the maximum flight level 100 restriction is in fact at the RTIP waypoint itself. There is also no mention of a 220 knot speed restriction along the following leg on the approach chart. It has always been my preference to delete any unnecessary waypoints that are not shown or represented on the chart, as it declutters the route and makes things simpler. Delete both the SP30B and D0710 waypoints by pressing the clear key and line selecting them. Lastly, close the discontinuity that results. We now have a clear path between RTIP and the Schiphol VOR that much better represents what is on the actual chart. So we will, however, need to set up the maximum flight level 100 restriction at RTIP. Enter a /-100 and drop it in by RTIP. This will set the maximum altitude restriction of flight level 100. I also want to make sure that we are at flight level 70 overhead the Schiphol VOR. A minimum restriction has already been set in the flight plan, but I want to fix a constant, so to speak, in the vertical profile so that we have plenty of time to compose ourselves after passing Schiphol before the real tough stuff starts, the hand flying stuff. So enter /70 and drop it in by Sierra Papa Lima. Minimum 3000 has also been set for Echo Hotel 657. That is perfectly fine. We just want to make 100% sure that we do not descend below the profile that is on the chart. I just switched the ND to plan mode, and now I'm stepping through the waypoints checking that everything looks okay. Things look fine to me with one exception. The fix OLGAX on the final approach is actually missing. The chart shows that OLGAX is 8 DME on the ILS. We will need to have intercepted a localizer by this point. We could add OLGAX to our flight plan, but since we'll be hand flying the intercept anyway, this is a perfect opportunity to go over the fix info page on the McDo and put OLGAX on the navigation display as a fix. So press the fix function key to get to the fix info page. Green boxes indicate that the FMS wants input from us, so enter OLGAX in 1 left. Note that the fix has appeared on the ND as a cyan triangle circled by green. Since we have plenty of time to burn on the approach, let's go through the function of this page. Everything that I enter in the fix info pages from this point on is purely for demonstration, not actually for the purposes of this approach. I'll be deleting it all later. So there are 2 fix info pages as indicated by the page number in the top right. Pressing the page key will switch us to page 2. Here we would be able to enter another fix, and pressing page again takes us back to page number 1. Along the top here we see the radial from the fix to our present position and the distance to it. Below we are able to enter a course from the fix and get information about the point at which the course intercepts the flight plan track. When a fix is entered, the abeam course to the flight plan track is computed if applicable. The course is shown on the ND as a white dashed line. In our case, it is 296. It is also shown in line 6 left. The next number along is the radial distance, the distance from the fix to the point at which this course intercepts the flight plan. In our case, this is 3 miles. The next column shows the estimated time over the fix. In our case, this is 12:43. Next up is the distance to go to the flight plan intercept point from our current location. Lastly is the altitude that the FMS forecasts are being at this point. To hammer this information home, let's enter a course of 020 from the fix manually. So enter 020 and drop it in 3 left. First up, note the white dashed line on the ND. The display is rather cluttered at the moment, but the course is indicated in white near the base of the line. So looking now at the McDo, we see that the radial distance is 11 miles, the ETO is 1241 Zulu, and the distance to go is 56 miles, and the forecasted altitude is at flight level 073. If we were to specify a course of, say, 090, which does not intercept our flight plan track at all, no intercept fills the line. That's a quick overview of the MD11's fix information pages. Unfortunately, unlike the Boeings, the MD11's FMS does not have the ability to draw circles on the ND. Since we do not need all the lines that we have drawn, clear them by pressing the clear key and then line selecting appropriately. The information will be cleared. It is not possible to clear the abeam line. Let's not forget our main reason for coming to this page in the first place, to place OLGACs on the ND for reference while intercepting the ILS. We must be established on the localizer by OLGACs. Before we move on, it's also important to mention that any of the tools within the aircraft are supposed to be used for you to make things easier on yourself. So let's also not forget that we're still on the eye and airbag and still have a lot to accomplish before we put this bird on the ground. So get to the takeoff approach page and verify that the landing weight is as expected and that runway length and elevation are correct. Approach speed is 156 knots and we will be doing flaps 35. Pressing on with airbag, it's time to set up the radios. On the nav radio page, enter Skipple VOR of 108.40. Also enter the ILS frequency and course of 108.75 and 004 and drop that in the ILS column. Had we not tuned these frequencies manually, they would have been auto-tuned, but I like to manually tune critical frequencies as it keeps structure to my checks and I am not relying too heavily on the automation. Up next is the brief. Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, ILS runway 36 center approach. Chart valid 2nd November 2009. Schiphol VOR is 108.4. ILS DME is 108.75. Approaches via the RTIP transition, 251 degree inbound to Schiphol VOR, then outbound on the 207 degree radial to 13.3 DME, where we will start our left turn to localizer intercept. We must be established on localizer by OLGACs 8 DME on the ILS. Glide slope intercept to final approach fix 6.2 DME at the latest. Final approach course is 004 degrees. We will overfly Schiphol VOR at flight level 70, then minimum 3,000 feet at 13.3 DME outbound. Final approach fix is 2,000 feet. Decision height is 190 feet, which is 200 feet above ground level, and bear in mind that the airport elevation is actually below sea level. Displaced threshold is -12 feet. Transition altitude is 3,000 feet. Highest minimum safe altitude is 2,300 feet to the southwest of the field. Missed approach is a straight out climb at 004 degrees, so same as the final approach course, and that goes to 2,000 feet. We must inform ATC immediately upon commencing a missed approach. The chart notes that simultaneous approaches may be executed on 3-6 right. It is unlikely this would be the case in such low visibility, but nonetheless, it is something to bear in mind. The ATIS reports visibility of 1,200 meters with wind 010 at 7 knots. Expect a wet runway with decreased braking action, full thrust reverse, and auto brakes medium today. Brief complete. Time for the approach descent checklist. First of all, we need to bring up the McDo and verify the landing data is checked and correct. Windshield anti-ice, this is a no-brainer today given the weather. Switch it on for both windshield, or both windshields. DH, we will set the DH to 190 radar altitude. And there it is there. Note that since we have selected radar, not barometric altitude, we will not be able to select this on the FCP. Passenger signs are on, hydraulic panel is auto. Lights, we are just passing through 10,000 feet, so set landing, nose gear, and runway turn off lights on. We will also turn on logo lights. We want everything lit up for this one. Also, verify that the high intensity light switch does not have a lit off indication. Getting back to the altimeter, we want to make sure that is at 1013 until reaching transition altitude of 3,000 feet. Then we go to 1008 hectopascals from there on. Descent approach checklist complete. Last up in the airbag is the go-around procedure that we covered in the brief. Now don't forget that this one is different to the non-precision approaches. If we do not see the runway environment at the decision height, we must go around without delay. We cannot level off and just keep looking. So that's it for the airbag checklist. We've just rolled wings level on course from RTIP to Sierra Papa Lima. Let's get VOR information up on the ND. So press the VOR 1 button on the ECP to bring up the cyan pointer, which is now pointing to the Skipple VOR. Looking at the McDo Nav radio page, note that VOR 2 has been auto-tuned to Skipple as well. Note the difference in text size between a manually tuned frequency and the one that has been auto-tuned. Pressing VOR 2 on the ECP will bring up the corresponding pointer. This one is green and is pointing appropriately at Sierra Papa Lima, or Skipple. We don't need both, so I'll take away number 2. Given the forecasted temperature and snow up ahead, icing conditions are pretty much a certainty. So let's quickly go over the ice protection on the MD11. Now the anti-ice panel is located on the overhead. We already turned on windshield anti-ice as part of the approach descent checklist. So turn on engine number 1, 2, and 3, wing and tail anti-ice. It's quite a few buttons here, but you'll get it. All of these systems take hot bleed air from the engines and run it through ducts to help prevent ice buildup. And in fact, anti-ice will burn off ice that's already accumulated. The wing anti-ice system provides ice protection for the outboard wing slats on the leading edge of the wing. Each wing has 8 slats, and it is the outboard 4 that are anti-ice with hot bleed air. Now the tail anti-ice system functions similarly to the wing anti-ice system. Hot bleed air is routed through the leading edges of the horizontal stabilizer, and engine anti-ice also uses bleed air taken from the 11th stage of the GE engines. This prevents ice buildup on the engine cowling. Windshield heat and defogging are both provided electrically. The windshields are heated by passing a current through a resistive oxide film on the outer glass pane, while defogging is provided by a similar system on the inner glass pane. I'm sure you guys want to know all of those pretty little details. Any ice buildup adds weight to the aircraft, and accumulation on the wings disrupts airflow, thus reducing lift. Even a very thin layer of ice coating the wings can become very dangerous, so it is vital to use anti-ice where conditions might require it. Remember, Also that it is an anti-ice system, not a de-ice system. It is designed to be activated before entering ice conditions, but again, as I said before, it can burn off a little bit of ice. So what actually are icing conditions? On the ground, if outside, air temperature is less than 6 degrees Celsius at the same time as either visible moisture, dew point, and outside air temperature spread within 3 degrees, there are snow, ice, slush, standing water on the taxiways, then icing conditions technically exist for you. If in the air, if the total air temperature is 6 degrees or less, with either visible moisture, dew point, and outside temperature spread within 3 degrees, ice detected alert displayed on the EAD, visible ice accumulation on the aircraft, which you won't see in Flight Simulator, then icing conditions obviously exist. I've just mentioned total air temperature. We have about 13 miles to run before reaching the Schiphol VOR, so I reckon we have a little time to talk about a few of the different types of air temperature you are likely to hear about in aviation. So total air temperature is measured by a probe outside that brings the air to rest relative to the aircraft. As the air is brought to rest, its kinetic energy is converted to thermal energy. Now don't forget, we all learned in school that energy cannot be created or destroyed. All that kinetic energy has to go somewhere, and most of it goes to thermal energy. This is called an adiabatic increase in temperature. The total air temperature is therefore always higher than the static or outside air temperature. The TAT is shown here on the EAD. It'd be no use just sticking your average thermometer out the window. The total air temperature probes are specifically designed for the job and are essential in computing static air temperature and hence true airspeed. You might sometimes hear total air temperature being called RAM air temperature. Static air temperature and outside air temperature are one and the same. There are actually specific anti-ice procedures for the General Electric powered MD11. One step that I missed out earlier because I wanted to make the point now was that on the GE powered MD11, engine ignition must be selected to override on when anti-ice is on. I will do that now here on the overhead, so pressing the ignition override powers on both igniters on all engines and bypasses the automatic ignition control. This function would be selected for emergency situations such as engine flameout when flying in heavy turbulence or precipitation, or in the case of the GE aircraft when engine anti-ice is on. This function similarly is on the 747 and 767 because they have the same engines often. I'll also flag something else up here, and that is that the correct procedure for the GE powered MD11s is to turn on engine ignition override, engine, wing, and tail anti-ice before initiating the descent into icing conditions where they are anticipated. With that in mind, we've acted a little late on this, but it's worked out well for the purposes of this demonstration. We are just about to pass overhead the Schiphol VOR now, so we need to lower our FCP altitude to allow the aircraft to continue its descent. 3,000 feet is our next altitude restriction, so let's set that. As you can see on the PFD, we are passing through 7,000 feet, the altitude we specified for this waypoint. So by reducing the FCP altitude further, we are clearing the aircraft to continue its descent. We will start hand flying a mile or so before Echo Hotel 657, but we have a little while to go before then, so let's consolidate our knowledge on the flight director as we will be using it a lot from here on out on this procedure. Now on the visual approaches, we were flying without the flight director and without auto throttle. On this one, however, since it is a precision approach, we will be making full use of both the flight director and the auto throttle. So I will quote from the FCOM here since it sums it up pretty well. It says, "The flight director provides visual commands to fly the aircraft. The flight crew can manually follow the commands or monitor the autopilot as it follows the commands." You could think of it this way. The commands you give through the FCP and McDo are carried out by the flight director, and it is either your job or the autopilot's job to follow these commands. So we will be following the flight director's commands all the way down to the point at which we see the runway, at which point we will fly visually. We will, of course, need to set the correct autopilot modes so that the flight director provides the guidance we want. Currently, the roll mode is nav and the pitch mode is prof. When we disengage autoflight, this will not change. Nav and prof will continue their inputs to the flight director just as they are now. The only difference will be that we will be following them, not the autopilot. We haven't talked about the flight director since the asymmetric takeoff, so that's my reason for the refresher here. We could, of course, flown this approach without the flight director, but that would be very demanding and intentionally depriving ourselves of such a useful resource in this weather would be foolhardy at best. So the same goes for auto throttle. The MD11's auto throttle is designed to control thrust right up to touchdown. So just as we did on the VOR and localizer approaches, we will leave the auto throttle to retard thrust at 50 feet. We are rapidly approaching the start of our turn, so set speed manually to 210 knots and set flaps 15. We will also set the altimeter to the local QNH 1008. We are not quite at transition altitude yet, but doing so will reduce workload ahead. So do this using the barrel set knob on the ECP and verify correct readout on the PFD. With the aircraft decelerating now to 210 knots and the turn coming up soon, get ready to disconnect the autopilot whenever you feel comfortable. It's good practice to disconnect it a while before making any considerable maneuvers, just to get a good feel of how the aircraft is balanced.
Autopilot.
So there we go, keep things stable and steady. At this point, we want to keep the flight director centered, just as it was before. Now bear in mind that we will still have the before landing checklist to complete. We can make our lives a little easier further down the road by accomplishing this now. So set the auto brakes medium and arm the spoilers. This will save a little time later. Echo Hotel 657 is getting very close now. Nav mode will command us to start the turn before we actually pass overhead the waypoint. We'll ignore that though and wait until the Skipple VOR DME reads 13.3. This is what is indicated on the chart. This turn to the left will be tough, so don't chase the flight director roll bar, but do follow the pitch guidance carefully. The aircraft is very sensitive in roll and a little unstable at slow speeds, so keep the turn very controlled and don't let the altitude get away from you. Lift acts perpendicular to the wings, so anytime you are in a turn, less of that lift is acting straight upward. So unless you compensate by increasing angle of attack or pulling back, the aircraft will drop. Notice that we are at a pretty high pitch angle to compensate for this.
Flaps 28.
Reduce speed to 190 knots and set flaps 28. The flight director is currently commanding a level altitude as we are a little south of the track that is calculated for us. Also take into account the glide slope indication to the right of the attitude display. It's looking pretty good at the moment, but we'll focus on the flight director for pitch guidance until we actually intercept the glide slope with approach mode on. Let's slow down finally to approach speed 156 knots. Drop the gear 2, and as the aircraft decelerates through flaps 35 speed,
Flaps 35.
drop flaps 35, and on the FCP, press the approach land to arm the approach and land modes. Land armed is enunciated on the FMA. This means that the localizer mode will engage once we capture the localizer, followed by glide slope tracking. Note that nav is still in magenta. This is still the active mode, so the flight director reflects this. With the navigation display in approach mode, we get a very clear indication of the position of the localizer relative to our aircraft. Keep flying the flight director. Both pitch and roll commands can make pretty quick shifts, for example from positive to negative pitch quite suddenly, so keep your flying smooth and precise and don't chase it too fast. We're being fairly relaxed with it here, and once established on the localizer and glide slope, it will be much more important to be spot on. We still have the before landing checklist to perform, but we will wait until we are established on the ILS before peeling our eyes off the instrumentation. We want to get the checklist done before we reach the final approach fix, but judging by the current DME, we still have plenty of time. So
Localizer
there goes the
live.
localizer. Watch the CDI As it moves in, expect to see the localizer and glide slope modes engage on the FMA. And there we go, they are both now indicated, meaning that they are active. The flight director will now be giving us guidance for these modes. If we follow that guidance perfectly, we will end up spot on the localizer and glide slope. I turned a little too far there though, so we will need to gently compensate by turning the other way. It requires a lot of care and attention to hand fly as accurately as an ILS requires. As always, just keep smooth and gentle. Things can get away from you very fast, and the localizer and glide slope are very sensitive and become even more so the closer you get. We're spot on the glide slope and the localizer is centering nicely. We also managed to get established well before Olgax. There goes the radar altimeter. Don't forget that our decision height is based on radar altitude rather than barometric as we have had for the previous approaches. Let's quickly go through the before landing checklist before we get any further down the approach corridor. Spoilers and auto brakes, gear 4 green, flaps 35. No bad indications on the EAD, altimeter set 1008 for the local QNH. Before landing checklist complete. Now that was a quick one. We have a disadvantage in Flight Simulator that we are limited to single pilot operations only, so we need to balance our time between looking at instruments and doing other things such as checklists. On a hand-flown precision approach, that is especially important. Checklists are vital, of course, but flying the aircraft should always be first priority. Speaking of which, we're doing a pretty good job as it is at the moment. Once you have the aircraft established on the ILS, actually staying on it is not that difficult. The key is not to make any sudden turns or pitch changes. Keep turns within 5 degrees, ideally even less. The localizer gets much more sensitive the closer we get. The slightest deviation can show up a lot on the instrument, so it's important to get a good scan going at this point. We can refer either to the navigation display for localizer information or to the PFD. The course deviation indicator on the ND is centered, indicating that we are spot on the localizer. The same goes for the deviation indicator on the PFD below the attitude display. The PFD crams a lot of information into a small area. This means that we can easily move our eyes constantly between the flight director, speed, altitude, vertical speed, localizer, and glide slope indications since they are all so close together. So we passed through 1,500 feet a while ago and the green box is indicated on the EAD. I'm happy with the way the approach is going so far. Auto throttle is keeping us on speed and we are trimmed well enough that the aircraft can be flown pretty much with a finger and thumb. There's actually no wind indicated on the ND and that snow doesn't seem to have turned up. And that's a good lesson to check the ATIS a little later on the approach than we did. Still though, anti-ice is still required due to all this visible moisture. I also can't make any runway in front of us and that altitude is counting down quickly. Remember, 190 is our decision height, so be ready for it. The ground is looming ahead, so keep the window included in your scan. Approaching minimum is called out at 100 feet above. So we're still looking. I see the lights and there's the runway. We're good to continue our descent through minimums. Keep that rate of descent in check as you fly visually. Maneuver gently but with authority to line up on center line. You certainly don't want to screw it up in the last few seconds. So at 50 feet, thrust levers retard. Flare at 30 feet and touch down firmly. You don't want to grease it onto a wet runway. Fly the nose gear on and engage reverse thrust, verify deceleration. Ride that center line using rudder input, decelerating through 80 knots. You will select reverse idle. So here it comes now, there's reverse idle. We can go to reverse idle. And then at 60 knots, we will stow the reversers. Take out auto brakes by braking manually and take her off. The high speed turn off. Keep the turn gentle and constant. We're still going pretty fast, even for a high speed exit. So keep slowing down to about 15 knots maximum for this next turn. And there we go. Welcome to Amsterdam, home to the last MD11s in scheduled passenger service. I hope you guys enjoyed this approach and the challenge of hand flying a precision ILS. Until next time, throttle on.